Hello and welcome to Byju's Exam Prep IAS. I welcome you all to today's explained session. It's Friday, it's 8 p.m. means it's time once again to go back to the drawing board and take out some of the most important topics that have been in the news in the recent past from the UPSC point of view. And if you have been reading the news, you would see that the news is filled with a lot of important things that are happening around the world. Be it the G20 summit, be it the UNFCCC COP27, be it the war between Russia and Ukraine that is just not ending. But in today's session, what we have tried to do is, we have tried to pick up the most important of all those topics. A topic that is not just important for our examination point of view, but also important for us just as humankind. As you know, nations across the world are together in Egypt where they are discussing how exactly can we stop global warming. We have the COP27, that is the Conference of Parties number 27, 27th conference of the UNFCCC, that is the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change. It's an annual gathering where nations across the world actually come together, brainstorm ideas. How can we get rid of global warming? How can we sustain Earth for longer time periods? In this session, we will be discussing today what exactly is COP27, what were the other significant takeaways from the other COPs that happened earlier, what is it that is under discussion in this COP27, and most importantly, what is India's stand on this entire issue? Where does India stand? What are the commitments that we have made? So without any further delay, let's begin with this explained session. Now, as you know, the COP27 is being held in Egypt. This is at a place called Sharm el-Sheikh. Now, the COP27 is a conference of parties of UNFCCC and it holds its meeting every single year. For example, the last COP, that is the COP26, was at Glasgow. It was at Glasgow that the Prime Minister of the country actually made a lot of important announcements, including telling the world that India will try to achieve net zero by 2070. So these kind of big announcements are made usually in the COP. Similarly, if you remember a few years back, there was a Paris Climate Change Summit. Paris Climate Change Summit was also nothing else but this only. It was a meeting of the UNFCCC Conference of Parties. Now, there are a lot of reasons why it is significant, but do remember, because this year, the G20 summit in Indonesia and this UNFCCC COP is actually happening together simultaneously. That is why you would see, since most of the world leaders, that is the primary leader of their respective nations, they are participating in G20. That is why in the UNFCCC COP27, you don't see any presidents or prime ministers. It is not because they don't find importance of this event. It is just that they are occupied with the G20 right now. From India's side also, since the Prime Minister is representing India at the G20 summit in Indonesia, at the COP27, we have the Union Minister of Environment that actually represented India and presented India's document there. We will be discussing about that document also in detail. But first, let's go back to the drawing board and see what exactly is the COP. COP here stands for Conference of Parties in simple terms. It's an annual meeting of all the member nations that are a part of the UNFCCC, that is United Nations Framework for Climate Change Convention. Now, this particular initiative started in 1994, and as the name suggests, the primary aim of UNFCCC was to ensure that the greenhouse gas emissions around the world, their quantity is curtailed. Because as you know, the greenhouse gases actually harm the environment in such a way which is leading to a lot of detrimental impact. We have seen how the climatic conditions have become erratic. We have seen nations around the world facing different kind of troubles. Look at what happened in Pakistan a few months back. They faced the most devastating floods in their entire history. Look at China, which actually faced drought for many weeks straight. All of these erratic climatic patterns can be linked somewhere to global warming. That goes back to the greenhouse gas emissions and nothing else. The UNFCCC is an initiative by nations around the world to come together and formulate a strategy, formulate a formula so that this situation can be curtailed in the long run. This is why this particular UNFCCC convention is extremely, extremely important. Till date, it has 198 parties and it has its annual meeting since 1995. What do? They are the primary platform where the nations around the world come together to discuss these issues, where they want to get rid of all these problems or related to climate change. So they make policies to mitigate climate change. They also try to ensure cooperation from different countries coming together, cooperation between developed and the developing nations, and they also try to educate, train and raise public awareness on the question of climate change. Now, this is the 27th edition of the COP. Earlier also, there have been very, very important takeaways from multiple COPs. Let me share with you just a few of them. The first one was held in Berlin, 1995. However, the most important takeaway so far, apart from the Paris Climate Change Summit, was actually in COP3 that was held in Kyoto, that led to the formulation of the Kyoto Protocol. Now, Kyoto Protocol at that time was the world's first attempt to put the responsibility on the developed nations, to tell the developed nation that you are the ones who are mainly responsible for climate change, for increasing the average temperature of the earth, and it is your responsibility to ensure that the entire world, the developing nations specifically, are actually taken out of all this trouble. The Kyoto Protocol also came up with the concept of common but differentiated responsibility. Common but differentiated responsibility means when nations around the world agree that yes, it is our collective responsibility that we should fight against climate change. However, the responsibility is not the same for every country. While a few countries can say that we are the ones who are responsible for climate change, that is the developed nations. As you know, it is their industrialization, mainly in the 19th and the 20th century, that led to increasing temperature. The developing nations, on the other hand, have not contributed to climate change as such. But now that they are also polluting the environment, if the developing nations have to transition to cleaner energy, they should be held by the developed nations. So the responsibility is common. Everyone has to cut down emissions, but how much, that is different. That is called common but differentiated responsibility. Developed nations should step up their efforts, should contribute more money, should cut down their emissions more, as compared to the developing nations, which should not have to go all the way out just in order to cut down on the greenhouse gas emissions. Then there was COP8, which was held in India in 2002. Not a lot of great outcomes came here, but the significant part is it was actually held in India. It was decided that we will try to strengthen technology transfer from developed to the developing nations. When the developing nations are told by the developed nation that you have to go ahead, adopt cleaner technology, adopt cleaner fuel, at the same time they should also transfer technology. At the same time they should also give enough funds to the developing nations to do the same. COP21, probably the most important one, is the Paris Climate Change Summit. Paris Climate Change Summit, or the COP21, was a platform where the nations around the world said that, okay, we will submit something called NDCs. NDCs means nationally determined contributions. So nations around the world in Paris in 2015 decided that, okay, what we will do is we will try and come together and make certain commitments. Commitments such as, in the coming years, in these many years, we will cut down our emission by this much. In the coming years, we will cut down our emission by that much. This is the amount of renewable energy that we will produce, so on and so forth. So these commitments were submitted. The idea was all the countries should commit to taking these actions so that we can stop the increase in the average temperature of the earth to maximum of 2 degrees. Maximum of 2 degrees. However, many experts say that even if all the nations do achieve their own goals, which is not a possibility anyway, because these goals are not legally binding. Many of these goals were just made by the government because they thought that, okay, we'll have good press, we will actually present a good face, but in reality, it is very difficult to imagine that all these goals will actually be met. But the experts say, even if, for once, let's imagine all these goals are met by the government, even then, you would not be able to stop the rise in the global temperature to 2 degrees Celsius. Even then, it will go way, way beyond 2 degrees Celsius, which is a great, great cause of concern. India is said to be one of the few nations that are on track to achieve their nationally determined contributions, while the others have seemed to have forgotten it. If you remember, when Donald Trump became the US president in 2016, one of the first decisions that he actually took was that I am withdrawing from the Paris climate deal. He said that no, this is very biased against USA. This is in favor of countries such as China, India. We will not cut down our emissions. So USA from 2016 to 2020, under the Donald Trump era, never worked towards their NDCs. Similar is the case with many, many other nations. So the contributions or the promises that were made by the nations have still not been fulfilled. Now let's fast forward to COP27. The COP27 is discussing a lot of different agendas. At the top of the list, there's the agenda of loss and damage funding. Now, what is loss and damage funding? See, when you talk about climate change, let's try and understand what will happen with climate change. What exactly is the problem? See, the problem is when you say that climate is changing, or when you say that the average temperature of the earth is increasing, the imminent impact would be that the polar ice caps, the huge ice that is actually in the Arctic, the Antarctic, these ice caps will start to melt. Because when the temperature increases, they will not be able to sustain the solid form, so they will start to melt. Now, when they will start to melt, obviously what will happen? The average level of the sea will increase. When the sea level increases, which are the nations which will be at the greatest risk? The nations which are small island nations, which are in the middle of nowhere, the nations which have a very, very low level of ground clearance, those are the nations that will be at the most risk. So obviously, it is the island nations, the small island nations that are running after the other nation that please take some action. So what happened was, since 1991, a small island nation called Vanuatu, they have been making this demand that we, the small island nations, are the ones that are at the most risk. We don't have a lot of money, so other nations around the world need to help us. They represent a group of other small island nations called Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS. This is an alliance of these small island states that say that it is the responsibility of the entire world because it is because of their pollution that we are suffering. We don't even have any industries. We don't even pollute the environment in any way whatsoever. It is a big, powerful nation that are polluting the environment, and we are the ones who are actually bearing all these consequences. So our loss, our damage has to be funded by the other nations. The other nations must fund it. We should actually get money from them. This is a demand that they have been making for a long time. At COP27, it was expected that there will be discussion on this. Now, the problem is, every nation around the world says that yes, we know that there's a problem with climate change. Yes, we know the global temperatures are increasing. We want to stop it. But when it comes to funding, when it comes to money, everything stops there. Even the most richest nations, the most developed nations in the world have not really been willing to donate a lot of money to those nations which are vulnerable, which are the developing nations. The rich nations, which are historically responsible for climate change, have not really helped the poor nations. In fact, they have been wanting the developing nations to cut down on their emissions. Now, the COP27 comes in at a very, very interesting and important time. See, it comes in at a time of the ongoing Ukraine-Russia war. Now, what is the direct connection of Ukraine-Russia war with COP27 or with climate change? When you talk about Europe, Europe has always been very, very proud that we don't use fossil fuels. They say that we don't use fuel, or we don't use coal, we don't use these kind of things, we don't use fossil fuels. They say that we are more dependent on renewable energy, nuclear, solar, wind, natural gas that is coming from Russia. Now what has been happening is, because of the Ukraine-Russia war, most European countries have put sanctions on Russia, and they have said that we will not buy natural gas from Russia. Now, because the winters again are starting in Europe, and European winters are very, very harsh, very harsh. In Europe, usually they have a central heating infrastructure where in the center of the city, they actually produce heat and then they transfer it to as many houses as possible. So it's a central heated kind of a mechanism that is set up. Now, what is happening is, because Europe is not getting enough supply of natural gas, they are ultimately going towards using fossil fuel once again. Something that they did not want, but they don't have any option. That is why many people are saying, because Europe itself is in the middle of an energy crisis right now, most probably we will not see these kind of things being discussed in the COP27. Because Europe will only discuss it when Europe actually is in a position to lecture the world. They are not in a position to lecture the world right now, because they are the ones who are polluting it right now, because they don't have any other option. The global temperatures are increasing at a very fast pace. They have already increased by 1.1 degrees Celsius. Now, over here, there's one other key detail I wanted to share with you. When you say the global temperature should not rise over 2 degrees Celsius or should not rise by over 1.5 degrees Celsius, what I want to ask you is, how do you compare this? Means it should not rise by 2 degrees Celsius as compared to what? There has to be a base temperature, right? As compared to what exactly? You are saying that it should not go beyond 2 degrees Celsius. So what we calculate it is, we actually take the base of pre-industrial era average temperature. Pre-industrial era average temperature. This is what we take into consideration. And when we take this into consideration, that is how we say that the global temperature should not go beyond this as compared to that. Now, the temperatures, if they rise to 1.7 to 1.8 degrees Celsius of the 1950s level, that is a pre-industrial era revolution, as per the IPCC, half of the world's population could actually be in a life-threatening situation. That is why it is extremely, extremely important for the nations to come together. Now in Paris, as I said, the countries gave their own contributions. They said that we will try to achieve this. The goal was, we will try to stop the global rise in temperature to 2 degrees Celsius and preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But again, these are just talks, because as per the experts, even if all these nationally determined contributions are fulfilled, even then, we will not be able to stop the global rise in temperature to 2 degrees Celsius. It will go way, way, way beyond. Whenever you talk about climate change, international summits, there is one big question that comes to everyone's mind. From where would you get the money? Because switching to low emission technology, switching to greener fuels, switching to new kind of technology that do not pollute the environment is costly. See, it is very easy for a country to just dig out coal, burn coal and make energy. Yes, that harms the environment, but what is the alternative? The alternative can be nuclear, can be solar, it can be wind. All of that are expensive. Nuclear, very expensive. Solar, the prices are coming down now, but it is still much more expensive. Also, it is dependent on the climate. That is why, when you are saying that the developing nations should switch to cleaner fuel, should switch to cleaner energy, you also have to give them money. Climate financing has actually been a big problem. Yes, the developed nations are saying that we will actually go ahead with it, but the problem is, internationally, the one mechanism that was set up in the UNFCCC was called the Green Climate Fund. Try and understand this. The Green Climate Fund was set up in UNFCCC where it was decided that the developed nations will contribute $100 billion per year. $100 billion per year they will contribute, so that this money can be given to developing nations and they can transition to clean energy. The problem is, so far this $100 billion mark has not been reached. The developed nations are just not giving enough money, number one. Second problem is that whatever money that they're actually giving, see, there are two ways in which you can get money. One way is a loan and the other way is a grant. There's a big difference between the two. Loan has to be repaid. Loan has to be paid back, while the grant does not have to be repaid. Does not have to be repaid. Now, as you can imagine from here, the developing nations want that the money should come in the form of a grant, that they don't have to repay it. The developed nations, on the other hand, are actually more interested in giving this in the form of a loan so that they can get the money back. This is a big issue that is still unresolved. The second issue here is that where is it that the money is coming from? What is the source of the money? If the source of the money is the government, then it can be in the form of a grant. It is possible. But the problem is, most of the money is not coming from the government. It is coming from multinational institutes which actually borrow money, which actually give money to the other source and they earn some interest. World Bank and these kind of institutions. So when the money is not coming from the government, it is coming from these multilateral institutions, it will never ever be in the form of a grant. It will always be in the form of a loan, and that has still not been resolved. As I said, the UNFCCC has accepted the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, which simply means that yes, it is everyone's responsibility to stop climate change. It is a common responsibility. However, who is responsible for it at what level is very different. The steps to be taken by developed nations are different as compared to the steps to be taken by the developing nations, and they can't be the same. That is why if US and Europe today say, see, China is polluting so much, India is polluting so much, the problem is you are not looking at what happened in the past, you are only looking at the present. It is accepted throughout the world that the reason why we are in such a mess is because of the industrial era development that took place in Europe, that took place in US. So they are the ones who were responsible in the past. Now they have developed, they have transitioned to green energy. Now when the chance is with India and China to develop, you can't take away this chance from our nation just by saying, no, you are late to the party. You should have come earlier. So this question of common but differentiated responsibility has to be accepted. Now let's come to what India has been doing. India has been said to be a leader of the developing nations, where India has been putting forward the demand of the developing world, what the developing world wants, and how is it that the developing world wants to take help from the developed nations. Now, as I told you last year, when the COP26 was held in Glasgow, India was represented by a Prime Minister, where Prime Minister actually made an announcement where he said that we are giving Panch Amrit. Means India is actually announcing 5 commitments for the entire world. Number 1, we will reach non-fossil fuel energy capacity to 500 gigawatts. Now, this is where India has actually been making a lot of good progress. India has made a lot of good progress in solar energy especially. The cost of solar energy production has come down drastically in the past few years, especially because of the efforts of the government. This is where India is on the right track. Second, fulfill half of energy requirements via renewable energy by 2030. Again, may be possible because of solar. Reduce 1 billion carbon emissions by 2030. Reduce carbon intensity by over 45% by 2030. Achieve the target of net zero by 2070. Many nations around the world have criticized India, especially for this particular point, the point number 5. They are saying that countries such as India should have a stricter target. Just for comparison, China has actually announced that they will reach net zero by 2060. So the net zero target is again not binding on any country. No one can be forced that this is our net zero target. It depends on what target does the country feel comfortable with. India has set a target of 2070. Now, what exactly do we mean by net zero? Net zero is a situation where if there is X greenhouse gas emissions in India, if India is producing X amount of greenhouse gas, then the same amount, X, should be absorbed by our forest, should be absorbed by all the carbon sink that we are developing. So we should have a situation where we are able to actually even out and make it zero, the number of the total emissions that we have and the total emission that we are utilizing. Now the government of India, as I told you, was represented in the COP by Union Environment Minister Shri Bhupendra Yadav. In this COP, it was decided by nations around the world, whoever has promised net zero, nations should actually submit a plan. How are you planning to achieve that? Because randomly telling that I will achieve net zero by this year does not really make any sense. So nations around the world were asked to submit their documents, which again, as expected, many nations did not do. But India did submit a document plan for how are we planning to achieve net zero. In this plan, there are a lot of very interesting things, but just to highlight a few things, the Indian government is saying that we will focus on public transportation, giving a push to public transportation. Then we will focus on nuclear energy expansion. This is also interesting. Why? Because if you look at the trend in the past decade or so, most developed nations, especially in Europe, are actually going away from nuclear energy. Look at Germany, look at France, look at Japan. Okay, not a European country, but even then, look at Japan. These are the countries that are actually going away from nuclear. Why? Ever since the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan, most of the countries have thought that this is not really very safe. So they are actually going towards something else. They are trying to see other options, solar, wind, etc. And they have actually been moving away from nuclear. At the same time, nations such as India is going forward to expand our nuclear energy horizon even more. The government document also says that we have increased our own target of ethanol blending. As you know, ethanol blending now is, the aim is to reach 20% blending by 2025. We have already achieved 10%. So at present, 10% fuel, petrol that you find is blended with ethanol. Then the government of India also talks about increasing financing for climate change initiatives. Most importantly, and let me write it here, most importantly, the government is focusing on National Hydrogen Mission. National Hydrogen Mission. So government of India thinks that good way forward that many countries are not thinking of can be the production of green hydrogen and using that as a fuel. Now there are various types of hydrogen, green hydrogen, grey hydrogen, blue hydrogen, depending upon how exactly is it produced. Green hydrogen is the cleanest of all those and it can be a great source of energy, and this is where India is actually planning to go ahead. Now as I said, out of all the nations that were supposed to submit those planned documents, only 57 nations have submitted and India is one of them. India wants to go towards a low emission pathway. Now, although we have actually submitted these documents, the one interesting part is India has also accepted that this will require trillions of dollars to be spent. Now, this is very interesting. Try and understand this. On one hand, the government of India has made a commitment to the world that, see, we are working towards this, we'll achieve this climate change goal, these are our contributions, this is what we'll do, so on and so forth. However, at the same time, there is something else that the government has done. What the government has done is, government has also said at the same time that achieving this will require a lot of funding. And that funding we expect from the developed nations. So if the developed nations go back, that no, we can't give you funding, then don't hold us accountable for not achieving our net zero target of 2070. So on one hand, the government of India has announced this target of net zero by 2070. But apart from just taking the responsibility ourselves, we have given the responsibility to developed nations also, that it is your responsibility also to make sure that we are actually getting these funds. Only and only then we will be able to achieve the net zero target. So it's a shared responsibility and not just with the government of India. There is one more interesting fact that came up recently and I want to discuss about that as well. There has been something good that has been happening on the front of climate change, especially from the G7 nations. What the G7 nations have done recently is they have come together under the leadership of Germany and they have announced something called the Climate Shield Fund. Now this is just like any other climate fund where the developed nations decided that we will come together, contribute money, and that money will be then given to developing nations so that they can actually use this money so that they can fight against climate change. This is called the Global Shield Fund. It will be coordinated by G7 nations, led by Germany specifically. Now, it's not unfair to say that yes, developed nations such as Germany, France, etc. have been contributing some money to all these climate change related initiatives. Just that the scale of the problem is so huge that you require much more from these nations as compared to what they usually do. As per this particular fund, they are collaborating with 58 climate vulnerable economies and they will try to help them economically. The interesting part is they have taken names of a few countries which will be held. One interesting name that you might have heard of is Pakistan. They have said that Pakistan will be one of the first countries to be held with this fund. Now, who will pay for the fund? As I said, the developed nations. The other point here is, if you look at the total emissions, the total carbon dioxide emissions made by the nations around the world, see, China, yes, at the top, USA, India, Russia, you can argue that, see, China and India are some of the largest greenhouse gas emitters. But the problem is here, if you calculate this by per capita, that is energy consumption per head, how much energy does an average Indian consume as compared to how much energy does a US citizen consume? You will see that there is a lot of difference between the two. You will see that it is not even comparable. An average US citizen consumes so much more energy as compared to an Indian citizen, and that is why it is unfair to say developing nations such as India, China should cut down on their emissions and the developed nations should continue like that. In this Climate Shield Fund, Germany has started with the contribution. They said we will contribute 170 million euros. Ireland has also come up. Now remember, many of these nations are not even G7 nations. Ireland is not a G7 nation, but even then other developed nations are also coming up to help them because everyone realizes that this is now a global problem and everyone has to come together to resolve this. For example, Ireland committed 10 million euros. France announced 20 million initially. Then Canada, Denmark, they also said that we'll contribute. USA has also come up. They have said that we'll also contribute, but how much they have not made clear so far. So USA has come up, but they have not announced how much. Now, with respect to USA also realizes this problem. In fact, if you remember, just a few months back, it was so much in the news that they have recently passed a law under the presidency of Joe Biden where US government will be spending more than $300 billion, billion with a B. They will be spending more than $300 billion to give a push to green energy in the US. So it's not that US doesn't realize that there is a problem and it has to be resolved. Just that they are not willing to give this money outside their country and they just want to spend that within the country. Now, what happens with COP27 after the outcome? Do we actually see any change in the long run? It remains to be seen. Just a couple of more thoughts here. Understand this. Even if today the countries cut down on their greenhouse gas emissions drastically, the greenhouse gases have a long life. It's not that from tomorrow we'll start to see some change in the environment. No. For any positive change to happen in the environment, it will take a long time. So even if we start today, the climate or the global temperature will still continue to rise for some years. So the time to take action is right now. You will not see any immediate result. You might see results after 5 decades, 6 decades, because this is how long the greenhouse gases may stay in the atmosphere. So if we don't take action right now, we might end up in a situation where the only planet where the human life exists would not be worth living anymore. So sincerely hoping that some positive action is taken, but it remains to be seen in the long run. This is it for today's explained session. I hope it made it very, very clear to you what is COP27, what is India's stand, and what are the other countries thinking about this. We'll join you next week for explained session at Friday 8 p.m. Again, if you have not liked this YouTube channel so far, please do hit the subscribe button. If you like this video, if you like these kind of classes, do share it with the other friends as well who are preparing for the UPSC Civil Service examination. Thank you so much for watching. Jai Hind.